Picture this: you're standing in front of Buckingham Palace, camera in hand, ready for that perfect vacation selfie. The red-coated guard stands motionless, rifle at his side, bearskin hat towering above his head like a black monument to British tradition. He's been standing there for hours, they say. Never moves. Never speaks. Never reacts. You think he's just a living statue, a tourist attraction put there for your entertainment. You're about to discover how dangerously wrong you are. What happens when ordinary tourists push these highly trained soldiers past their breaking point? When vacation fun turns into international incidents? When the man in the funny hat reveals he's actually a combat veteran with the reflexes of a coiled spring? The stories you're about to hear aren't just embarrassing tourist moments. They're encounters that made headlines, sparked diplomatic conversations, and reminded the world that behind those ceremonial uniforms stand some of the most elite soldiers on the planet. From the American college student who learned why you never, ever touch a Queen's Guard, to the social media influencer whose prank attempt became a viral disaster for all the wrong reasons, these are the true stories of what happens when immovable objects meet unstoppable tourists. Welcome to the real world behind the pageantry, where tradition meets reality with a force that changes everything. Sarah Martinez had been planning this London trip for 3 years. Every detail mapped out, every landmark researched, every photo opportunity carefully plotted on her Instagram feed. The 22-year-old college senior from Phoenix had saved every penny from her campus coffee shop job to make this dream vacation happen. Standing outside Buckingham Palace on that crisp October morning, phone clutched in her manicured hands, she felt like she was living in a movie. The morning light caught the gold details of the palace gates just right. The crowds hadn't gotten too thick yet. Everything was perfect for content creation. "This is going to get me so many followers," she whispered to her travel companion, Emma, who was busy adjusting her own phone settings. The Queen's Guard stood at his post like he had for the past 2 hours, rifle held at present arms, his tall bearskin hat casting a shadow over eyes that stared straight ahead at nothing and everything. His red tunic was immaculate, every button polished to mirror brightness. His black trousers held creases sharp enough to cut paper. Sarah had done her research. She knew these guards were supposed to be impossible to distract. She'd watched countless YouTube videos of tourists trying and failing to get reactions. But she also knew that the really viral content came from being different, from pushing boundaries just a little bit further than everyone else. "Watch this," she told Emma, stepping closer to the guard. The first few photos were standard tourist shots. Sarah posing next to the guard, pretending to march in step with him, making exaggerated saluting gestures. The guard remained motionless, professional, giving her nothing. But Sarah hadn't flown 4,000 miles for basic content. She moved closer, close enough to smell the wool of his uniform, close enough to see the individual threads in the fabric. Her phone was still recording as she reached out, fingers extended toward the fuzzy texture of his bearskin hat. "Sarah, don't," Emma whispered, sensing something was about to go very wrong. The moment Sarah's fingertips made contact with the hat, the world exploded into motion. The guard's head snapped toward her with mechanical precision. His eyes, which she had assumed were vacant and, unseeing, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach drop. In one fluid movement that happened faster than her brain could process, he took a step back, brought his rifle to port arms position, and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. "Step back from the Queen's Guard." The words hit Sarah like a physical force. Every conversation in the surrounding crowd stopped. Hundreds of tourists turned to stare. Camera phones swiveled in her direction. She felt her face burning with embarrassment and something else, something that took her a moment to identify as genuine fear. But the guard wasn't finished. "Do not touch the Queen's Guard. Do not obstruct the Queen's Guard." His voice was trained, projected, designed to carry orders across battlefields. Sarah stumbled backward, her phone still recording, capturing every mortifying second of what was rapidly becoming her worst nightmare. The guard resumed his position with the same mechanical precision, but something had changed. His eyes, which had seemed unfocused before, now tracked every movement she made. She realized with growing horror that he had been aware of everything all along. Every tourist who posed near him, every child who tried to get his attention, every person who treated him like a living statue instead of a human being. Oh my God, Sarah muttered, backing away into the crowd that had formed around her. Did you get that? Please tell me you didn't get that. But Emma's wide eyes and raised phone told her everything she needed to know. Not only had Emma captured every second, but so had at least a dozen other tourists who had been hoping to witness exactly this kind of tourist meltdown. Within minutes, the videos were uploading to social media. Sarah Martinez from Phoenix, Arizona, had indeed created content that would get her attention. Just not the kind she had been hoping for. The guard's shout had attracted more than just tourist cameras. 2 Metropolitan Police officers approached the group, their presence turning Sarah's embarrassing moment into something more serious. "Miss, we're going to need you to move along," the taller officer said, his tone polite but firm. "And we'll need to have a word about respecting the Queen's Guard." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't just an embarrassing vacation story anymore. This was becoming an incident. "I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered. "I just wanted a photo. I didn't know he would react like that." The officer's expression suggested he'd heard this explanation approximately 1,000 times before. "The guards are soldiers, miss, not tourist attractions. They're armed, they're trained, and they're on duty protecting one of the most important buildings in the country." As the officers took down her information, Sarah became aware of the crowd that had gathered around her. Some faces showed sympathy, recognizing a fellow tourist who had simply made an unfortunate mistake. Others showed the particular mixture of amusement and judgment that people reserve for watching someone else's public humiliation. But it was the faces of the other guards that stayed with her longest. She could see them at their various posts around the palace complex, and, while they maintained their professional stillness, she sensed they were all aware of what had happened. Word traveled fast in their ranks, and she had just become a story they would tell each other during their brief moments off duty. Emma finally stopped recording and moved to Sarah's side. "Are you okay? You look like you're going to be sick." Sarah was not okay. The adrenaline that had flooded her system during the confrontation was leaving her shaky and nauseous. But worse than the physical reaction was the growing realization of what she had done. She had traveled halfway around the world to experience something magical, something quintessentially British, something that would give her stories to tell for the rest of her life. Instead, she had managed to embarrass herself, disrespect a soldier doing his duty, and create exactly the kind of ugly American tourist moment that would confirm every negative stereotype about her generation and her country. The police officers finished taking her information and moved on, but the damage was done. The crowd was dispersing, but she could hear fragments of conversation as people walked away. "Can you believe she actually touched him? Americans have no respect. I would die of embarrassment." Sarah wanted nothing more than to disappear into the London pavement. Instead, she found herself face to face with a middle-aged British woman who had been watching the entire encounter. "First time in London, dear?" the woman asked, her tone surprisingly kind. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "Well," the woman continued, "you've certainly made it memorable. That guard will be telling this story for years. They do talk amongst themselves, you know. You've probably become quite famous in their barracks already." The thought made Sarah feel even worse. She had come here to appreciate British culture and history, and instead she had become a cautionary tale. "The thing is," the woman went on, "those young men aren't just for show. That guard you startled, he's likely been to Afghanistan or Iraq. Maybe both. They're real soldiers with real jobs, and tourists sometimes forget that." Sarah looked back toward the guard's post. He had returned to his stoic stance, but she could see him differently now. Not as a colorful piece of British theater, but as a person. A professional doing a difficult job while thousands of strangers treated him like a prop in their vacation photos. "I feel terrible," Sarah admitted. "Good," the woman said, not unkindly. "That means you've learned something. Most tourists don't bother with that part." As Sarah and Emma walked away from Buckingham Palace, Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications. The videos of her encounter were already spreading across social media platforms, shared by fellow tourists who had witnessed her humiliation firsthand. By the time they reached their hotel that evening, #RoyalGuardTourist was trending on 3 different platforms. Sarah had gotten her viral moment, her burst of internet fame, her engagement metrics spike. She had never felt worse about anything in her life. The next morning brought a new horror. News outlets had picked up the story. American tourist learns hard lesson about British protocol, read one headline. When vacation photos go wrong, read another. The most painful was from a British tabloid, Yankee Doodle Don't, yet another American disrespects our guards. Sarah's phone rang constantly with requests for interviews, with friends and family who had seen the news, with her university's public relations department wanting to discuss brand management and institutional reputation. She had become exactly what she had never wanted to be, a stereotype, a cautionary tale, a punchline. But, as she sat in her London hotel room, watching the Thames flow past her window, something else began to emerge from her shame and embarrassment. A deeper understanding of what she had experienced, and why it mattered. That guard hadn't just been doing his job. He had been representing something larger than himself, something that connected the present moment to centuries of British history and tradition. And she had treated that tradition like a backdrop for her social media performance. The real story wasn't about a tourist making a mistake. It was about the moment when performative travel met authentic tradition, and tradition won. Sarah Martinez had come to London looking for content. Instead, she had found something much more valuable and much more uncomfortable, a lesson in respect, humility, and the difference between experiencing a culture and consuming it. The guard returned to his post the next day, and the day after that, and every day following. Tourists continued to pose near him, to try to distract him, to treat him as part of the scenery. But now there was a story attached to his post, a reminder that behind the ceremony and tradition stood real people doing real work. And, sometimes, when pushed too far, those people push back. Sarah's moment of viral fame would fade, as all such moments do. But, the lesson would remain, embedded now in the collective memory of tourists and guards alike. Sometimes the most unforgettable encounters are the ones that force us to see ourselves most clearly. Marcus Chen thought he understood viral content. The 26-year-old influencer from Melbourne had built his entire career on pushing boundaries, finding the moments that made people stop scrolling and start sharing. His YouTube channel, Extreme Tourist, had 3 million subscribers who tuned in to watch him attempt increasingly outrageous stunts at famous landmarks around the world. He'd been kicked out of the Louvre for trying to recreate famous paintings with tourists. He'd nearly been arrested in Times Square for his human statue challenge. His video of attempting to feed pigeons while bungee jumping off the Sydney Harbour Bridge had been viewed 47 million times. Standing outside Windsor Castle on a drizzly Tuesday morning in November, Marcus felt confident he was about to create his next masterpiece. His research team had spent weeks planning this stunt. They'd studied guard rotations, identified the least crowded times, even consulted with a former British Army officer about the exact protocols these guards were supposed to follow. The beauty of this, he explained to his cameraman, Jake, while adjusting his hidden body camera, is that everyone thinks these guards can't break character. But, I found footage from the 70s showing guards actually chasing tourists who got too aggressive. The internet just doesn't know about it because it happened before social media. Jake adjusted his telephoto lens, positioning himself across the courtyard for the perfect wide shot. "You sure about this, mate? That guard looks like he could bench press a car." The guard in question was indeed an imposing figure. Taller than average, with shoulders that strained against his red tunic, he carried himself with the particular stillness that comes from years of military training. His bearskin hat sat perfectly level, and his eyes stared straight ahead with the unfocused focus of a professional sentry. Marcus had done his homework on this particular guard. According to his sources, this was Guardsman Thompson, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan who had received commendations for valor under fire. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was about to try to provoke a man who had faced down actual enemy combatants in real warfare. "That's exactly why this will work," Marcus told Jake. "The bigger they are, the funnier it is when they can't do anything about tourists being annoying." Marcus had built his entire brand on this philosophy. The more serious and untouchable something appeared, the more his audience loved watching him deflated with irreverent humor. Sacred spaces, solemn ceremonies, formal protocols, they were all fair game in his world where everything existed primarily to generate content. The first phase of his plan was simple misdirection. He approached the guard like any normal tourist, phone out, taking standard selfies and group shots. Nothing the guard hadn't seen 1,000 times before. "Good morning, mate," Marcus said cheerfully to the guard, who of course didn't respond. "Lovely day for standing completely still, isn't it?" He gestured for Jake to keep recording as he began what he called his mirror challenge. The concept was simple: he would mimic everything the guard did, turning the guard's professional composure into an inadvertent comedy routine. When the guard stood at attention, Marcus stood at attention. When the guard shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, Marcus copied the movement with exaggerated precision. When the guard blinked, Marcus blinked dramatically. A small crowd began to gather, mostly other tourists who recognized Marcus from his videos. Some pulled out their own phones, sensing that something entertaining was about to happen. "This is good content already," Marcus said to his growing audience, both live and virtual. "But wait until you see what comes next." Phase 2 involved props. From his backpack, Marcus pulled out a plastic rifle that he'd purchased from a London toy store. It was obviously fake, painted bright orange to comply with UK toy regulations, but from a distance it created the visual effect he was looking for. Marcus began marching alongside the guard, matching his stride, creating what appeared to be a synchronized routine. The tourists around him laughed and applauded, and Marcus felt the familiar rush that came from successfully commanding an audience's attention. But the guard's reaction was not what Marcus had expected. Instead of maintaining his stoic composure, the guard's eyes flicked down to the toy rifle, then back to Marcus's face. Marcus caught the movement and felt a brief moment of uneasiness. Those weren't the vacant eyes of someone following protocol. Those were the alert, assessing eyes of someone making tactical decisions. "Still nothing," Marcus announced to his audience, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "These guys are like robots. Watch this." Phase 3 was where Marcus planned to cross the line from annoying to unforgettable. He had researched the exact boundaries of what tourists were and weren't allowed to do around royal guards. Touching them was forbidden. Obstructing their movement was forbidden. But there was a gray area around simply existing in their space, and Marcus planned to exploit that gray area for maximum comedic effect. He stepped directly in front of the guard, facing him, close enough that their faces were only inches apart. Close enough that he could see the individual whiskers of the guard's freshly shaved chin, close enough that he could smell the wool of his uniform and the leather of his boots. "What's the matter, mate?" Marcus asked in a stage whisper designed to be picked up by his hidden microphone. "Cat got your tongue? Or should I say, Queen got your tongue?" The guard's breathing remained steady, controlled, professional. But Marcus noticed something else. The man's hands, which had been relaxed around his rifle, had shifted to what Marcus's military consultant had taught him to recognize as a ready grip. "This is it," Marcus announced to his camera. "This is the moment where we find out if these guards are actually human or if they're just really well-dressed mannequins." Marcus began making faces at the guard. Silly expressions, exaggerated emotions, the kind of physical comedy that had made him famous on platforms where attention spans were measured in seconds. His audience loved it. The views were climbing in real time, and his phone was buzzing with notifications from people sharing the livestream. But something was wrong. The other tourists, who had initially been entertained by Marcus's antics, were beginning to look uncomfortable. A few were backing away, and Marcus heard someone mutter, "This feels like it's going too far." Marcus ignored them. He had learned early in his career that the moment you started second-guessing your instincts for the sake of other people's comfort was the moment you became just another boring content creator. "One more thing," he announced to his camera. "Let's see what happens if I actually touch the untouchable." This wasn't part of his original plan. Marcus had intended to stay just inside the legal boundaries of tourist behavior. But the momentum of the moment, the adrenaline of performing for a live audience, the intoxicating sensation of being watched by thousands of people in real time pushed him past his own carefully planned limits. Marcus reached out and placed his hand on the guard's shoulder. The world changed in less than 2 seconds. The guard stepped back with military precision, creating space between himself and Marcus. His rifle moved from parade rest to a position Marcus didn't recognize, but that sent every survival instinct he possessed into high alert. Step back. Move away from the guard. The voice that came out of the guard wasn't the polite, projected command that Sarah had experienced at Buckingham Palace. This was different. This was the voice of someone who had given orders under enemy fire, someone accustomed to being instantly and unquestioningly obeyed. But Marcus's fatal mistake was thinking this was still part of the performance. "Easy, mate," he said, hands raised in mock surrender while winking at his camera. "Just having a bit of fun." The guard's eyes narrowed. In that moment, Marcus stopped being a harmless tourist and became something else entirely, a potential threat who had made physical contact, who was carrying what appeared to be a weapon, and who was refusing to comply with direct orders. Armed police. The call went out across Windsor Castle's communications system, and Marcus finally understood that he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This wasn't content creation anymore. This wasn't a harmless prank. This was a security incident involving an armed guard, a potential weapon, and a tourist who had just demonstrated unpredictable behavior. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Armed police officers appeared from positions Marcus hadn't even known existed. Tourists scattered as the area was quickly cleared. Marcus found himself surrounded by professionals who were treating him not as an entertainer but as a genuine security threat. Down on the ground. Now. Marcus's mind reeled as he tried to process what was happening. The toy rifle that had seemed like such a clever prop was now being treated as a potential weapon. His refusal to immediately comply with the guard's orders was being interpreted as aggression. His entire elaborate prank had transformed into exactly the kind of security scenario these guards trained for. "It's just a toy." Marcus protested as officers moved to secure him. "It's obviously plastic. I'm making a video." But his explanations only made things worse. A person claiming to be making a video while carrying a replica weapon and harassing armed guards was not reassuring to security personnel. It was exactly the kind of cover story someone with malicious intentions might use. Jake, still filming from across the courtyard, captured everything. The takedown was swift, professional, and utterly humiliating. Marcus went from viral content creator to face down on Windsor Castle's ancient stones in less than 30 seconds. The investigation that followed revealed the depth of Marcus's miscalculation. British authorities took security around royal properties with deadly seriousness, and what Marcus had intended as harmless entertainment was treated as a genuine breach of protocol that had required armed response. The toy rifle, while obviously fake up close, had been convincing enough from a distance to trigger legitimate concern. Marcus's behavior, which he had crafted to seem playfully transgressive, had actually followed several patterns that security experts associated with potential attackers testing responses and boundaries. "The thing people don't understand," explained Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh during the debriefing that would later become part of official records, "is that these guards aren't performers. They're operational military personnel responsible for protecting some of the most high-value targets in the world. When someone exhibits unpredictable behavior around them, especially someone carrying what appears to be a weapon, they respond according to their training." Marcus spent 18 hours in custody while authorities determined that he posed no genuine threat. His video equipment was confiscated as evidence. His social media accounts were suspended pending investigation. The viral moment he had planned so carefully had indeed gone viral, but as documentation of his arrest rather than his cleverness. The real footage, captured by Jake and by security cameras, showed something Marcus had never intended his audience to see: the moment when internet culture collided with the serious business of national security, and lost. When Marcus was finally released, he faced a new reality. The story of his arrest had spread faster than any of his previous content. News outlets around the world had picked up the story of the influencer whose prank had triggered an armed response at Windsor Castle. But the story they told wasn't about clever content creation or boundary-pushing entertainment. It was about the dangerous trend of social media personalities treating real-world security as entertainment, and the serious consequences that could result. The guard returned to his post the following day, as guards had for generations. But something had changed in the way tourists approached him. Word had spread quickly through the networks that connected travelers and content creators. Windsor Castle was no longer a safe place for elaborate pranks. Marcus Chen had succeeded in creating unforgettable content. He had pushed boundaries and generated massive audience engagement. He had become famous around the world. He had also learned that some boundaries exist for reasons more serious than social media metrics, and that the most viral moments are sometimes the ones that destroy the careers they were meant to build. The morning fog rolled across the Tower of London like something from a Gothic novel, wrapping the ancient stones in grey mystery that made the whole fortress feel suspended between past and present. Elena Kowalski pulled her wool coat tighter as she walked through the entrance, her art history professor's words echoing in her mind about experiencing places with academic reverence and cultural sensitivity. At 24, Elena had earned this research trip to London through 2 years of perfect grades and a thesis proposal that had impressed even her most demanding professors. Her project on the evolution of British ceremonial traditions had brought her here to document and analyze the intersection of historical pageantry and modern tourism. Unlike the previous tourists whose encounters had made headlines, Elena approached the tower's yeoman warders and Queen's Guards with genuine respect and scholarly curiosity. She had spent months preparing, reading everything from military histories to anthropological studies of ceremonial behavior. Her notebook was filled with careful observations about posture, timing, the subtle ways these guards managed crowds while maintaining their ceremonial roles. She photographed from respectful distances, asked permission before taking pictures of people, and treated every interaction as an opportunity to learn rather than to generate social media content. The most fascinating thing, she wrote in her research journal that morning, is how these men balanced the demands of authentic military duty with the performance expectations of mass tourism. They're simultaneously real soldiers and living historical artifacts. Elena had been particularly drawn to one guard stationed near the Crown Jewels exhibition. She had observed him for 3 days running, noting the subtle ways he managed tourist crowds, the micro-expressions that flickered across his face during particularly challenging interactions, the professional courtesy he showed to visitors who treated him with respect. Guardsman Davies was a 10-year veteran of both the British Army and the Queen's Guard, though Elena didn't know this yet. What she did know was that he carried himself with a particular kind of quiet authority that suggested real experience beyond ceremonial duties. On her 4th day of observation, Elena witnessed something that would change her entire understanding of what these encounters really meant. The day started normally. Elena had positioned herself in the queue for the Crown Jewels exhibition, notebook discreetly tucked in her purse, observing the guard's interactions with the steady stream of tourists filing past his position. Most interactions were routine. Tourists took photos, children stared wide-eyed at his impressive uniform, elderly visitors nodded respectfully as they passed. The guard maintained his professional demeanor, acknowledging appropriate interactions with subtle nods while remaining properly at attention. But Elena noticed something else developing throughout the morning. A group of university students, clearly on some kind of spring break trip, had been testing boundaries. Nothing dramatic at first, just the kind of gradual escalation that Elena recognized from her studies of group behavior dynamics. "Watch this," she heard one of them say to his friends. "I bet I can get him to crack a smile." The young man approached the guard with exaggerated politeness, asking questions he knew couldn't be answered, making jokes designed to provoke reactions, gradually increasing his attempts to break the guard's composure. Elena found herself torn between her role as an objective observer and her growing discomfort with what she was witnessing. This wasn't the harmless tourist behavior she had been documenting. This felt like deliberate harassment disguised as harmless fun. "Excuse me," Elena said quietly to the student. "Maybe you should give him some space." The student turned to her with a dismissive look. "Relax, love. It's just a bit of fun. That's what he's here for, right? Entertainment for tourists?" Elena felt something crystallize in her mind. This was exactly the attitude her research had been trying to understand and critique. The reduction of human beings to tourist attractions, the assumption that ceremonial roles meant these guards existed primarily for visitor amusement. Actually, she said, louder now, he's a soldier doing his job. This isn't entertainment. But the student was already turning back to the guard, and his friends were encouraging him to push further. What Elena witnessed next would stay with her for the rest of her life. The student stepped closer to the guard, close enough to be intrusive, and began making increasingly personal comments. About the guard's uniform, his posture, his perceived inability to respond to provocation. "What's it like?" the student asked in a voice designed to carry, being a living statue. "Do you ever get to think your own thoughts, or did they train that out of you too?" Elena saw something change in the guard's posture. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would be obvious to casual observers, but she had been watching him for days and she recognized the subtle shift from ceremonial stillness to genuine alertness. "Maybe he's not even British," another student chimed in. "Maybe they just hire actors to dress up and stand here. I bet he doesn't even know anything about British history." That was when Elena realized the students had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had assumed that because the guard couldn't respond to provocation, he couldn't respond to anything. They had mistaken professional discipline for helplessness. Actually, a voice said from behind Elena, "He knows quite a lot about British history." Elena turned to see an older man in a yeoman warder uniform approaching the group. His expression was polite but carried undertones that made Elena's academic instincts alert her to pay close attention. "That guard you're entertaining yourselves with," the yeoman warder continued, "is Guardsman Davies. He's served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He holds a degree in medieval history from Cambridge University. And he's been listening to you lot make assumptions about his intelligence and his role here for the past 20 minutes. The students fell silent, suddenly, aware that their private joke had become a public conversation involving official personnel. "But here's the really interesting part," the yeoman warder went on, and Elena realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in her research. "Guardsman Davies has been assigned to this post specifically because he volunteers for it. He requests assignment to tourist-heavy locations because he believes in the educational value of what we do here." Elena felt her entire thesis shifting as she processed this information. These weren't reluctant soldiers trapped in ceremonial roles. At least some of them actively chose to interface with the public, saw their role as partly educational, partly protective, partly cultural preservation. "The Tower of London," the yeoman warder explained to the increasingly uncomfortable students, "isn't a theme park. It's an active military installation with nearly 1,000 years of continuous operation. The guards you see aren't actors or living statues. They're serving members of the British Army who happen to be performing one of the most historically significant duties in the military." Elena was scribbling notes as fast as she could write, realizing she was witnessing exactly the kind of authentic cultural exchange her professors had hoped she would find. "Now," the yeoman warder said, his tone remaining perfectly polite, "Guardsman Davies can't respond to your questions because he's on duty. But I can. Would you like to know what he's actually thinking about while he stands there?" The students nodded, now genuinely curious rather than simply provocative. "He's maintaining situational awareness of approximately 200 tourists in his immediate vicinity. He's monitoring for potential security threats, unusual behavior patterns, or emergency situations. He's tracking weather conditions that might affect visibility or crowd movement. And, yes, he's also thinking about medieval history, because this fortress has been continuously occupied by military personnel since 1066, and he takes that legacy seriously." Elena realized she was witnessing a masterclass in cultural education delivered by someone who had clearly had this conversation many times before. "The thing about our guards," the yeoman warder continued, "is that they're not just performing tradition. They're living it. Every day they stand these posts, they're connecting the present moment to 1,000 years of continuous military service. That's not a performance. That's a calling." The students were now asking genuine questions instead of making provocative comments, and Elena watched as the entire dynamic of the interaction shifted from antagonistic to educational. But, the most remarkable thing happened when one of the students asked if they could apologize to the guard for their earlier behavior. "You can," the yeoman warder said. "But, you'll need to do it properly." He explained the appropriate way to address a guard on duty, the respectful distance to maintain, the brief, formal acknowledgement that would be appropriate. Elena watched as the students, now genuinely remorseful about their earlier behavior, approached Guardsman Davies with proper respect. The guard's response was subtle but unmistakable to Elena's trained observation. A barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement, a slight softening around the eyes, the kind of recognition that passed between people who had moved from antagonism to mutual respect. That, Elena wrote in her notebook later, is what these encounters are really about. Not the viral moments when things go wrong, but the quiet moments when they go right. When tourists remember that the person in the uniform is actually a person. Over the following days, Elena's research took on an entirely different character. Instead of documenting the tension between ceremony and tourism, she found herself documenting something much more complex and beautiful: the ongoing negotiation between past and present, tradition and accessibility, individual humanity and institutional role. She interviewed yeoman warders who spoke passionately about their role as cultural educators. She observed guards who managed to maintain perfect military bearing while also serving as inadvertent ambassadors for British history and values. She documented the hundreds of positive interactions that happened every day, unnoticed and unrecorded because they didn't generate social media buzz. The viral videos show the exceptions, she wrote in her final thesis chapter. But the real story is in the routine successes. Every day, thousands of tourists encounter these guards and come away with a deeper appreciation for British history, military service, and the complex ways that tradition adapts to modern circumstances. Elena's research would eventually be published in the Journal of Cultural Heritage Studies, where it provided a counterpoint to the sensationalized stories of tourist misbehavior that dominated popular media coverage of Royal Guard encounters. But the most important impact was much more personal. Elena had arrived in London expecting to study the performance of tradition. Instead, she discovered that the best traditions aren't performed at all. They're lived, day by people who understand that the past and present aren't separate things but different faces of the same ongoing story. Guardsman Davies continued his duties at the Tower of London, as guards had for nearly a millennium. But now Elena carried his story with her, and, through her research, she ensured that story would reach people who might never visit London but who could still benefit from understanding what real cultural exchange looks like. The most unforgettable tourist encounters, Elena learned, weren't the ones that made headlines. They were the ones that changed how people understood the relationship between visitor and host, between curiosity and respect, between the individual moment and the sweep of history. In the end, the guards who fought back weren't fighting against tourism or cultural exchange. They were fighting for it, insisting that real encounters required real respect, and that the most meaningful traditions were the ones that brought out the best in everyone involved. The Tower of London still stands, still serves, still teaches. And every day, tourists have the opportunity to choose: they can seek viral moments of conflict, or they can seek something much more valuable and much more lasting. Most, Elena learned, choose wisely. The guards make sure of that.